Welcome to ETM Analytics' first take of the market. As per usual, I'm joined by Director George Glynos. George, a quiet start to the week. We've become quite accustomed to these crazy Mondays now, but looking just forward for this week, obviously the big event will be the Appropriation Bill. It's been 5 months, and South Africa will this week find out whether or not it has a budget to work from. And obviously, with how the legislation is put together before the Appropriation Bill can be tabled, they need a full majority on every single department's budget. So that is where the problem comes in, because the DA has already indicated that they're not going to support either the human settlements, the higher education bills. And if those can't pass, it's kind of like you have to support all of them for all of it to support. If you don't support all of them, they don't get to pass. And then the Appropriation Bill can't be tabled. So this week will be, I think, a great gauge for the temperature within the GNU and whether or not they can find a way to cooperate, especially in light of what happened to the Deputy Minister, Andrew Whitfield, of course, and the Makhonazi claims that's been going around. So definitely a very interesting political spectrum for South Africa this week. The other thing on our slate this week domestically is, of course, the latest inflation figures, which will be significant for the National Treasury's decision on whether or not to shift the inflation target.
Yeah, a couple of points. Just the first point on the Appropriations Bill. I think it's not all bad news if it doesn't pass. The irony of it all is if it doesn't pass, they're stuck on last year's budget and a percentage of it. So if you wanted to force some measure of fiscal consolidation on the government, this is one way to go about doing it. So don't be surprised if the budget numbers ironically improve as a result of all of this haggling that's going on in and amongst the GNU. But then there's also the accountability factor, and I for one like the fact that there is now accountability being leveled on the ANC in a way that wasn't being done previously. So that to me is a good thing. I wouldn't necessarily regard that as a bad thing. It does mean that there's a bit of uncertainty, but overall, I would still rather take this than just have whatever the ANC wanted railroaded through Parliament, and we just have to live with the consequences of it, whether we like it or not. On the inflation story, it's becoming interesting because inflation is ticking back above 3% now. So just that in itself changes the dynamic a little bit. If you consider that the objective is to ultimately target 3%, if you're nudging above 3% and to 3.1, that's not a big deal in and of itself. But the direction of the trajectory is perhaps more important. And the fact that it's now starting to trend or nudge a little bit higher is something that we've got to pay attention to. And it comes just at a time when Trump has announced all of these tariffs around the world. So there might be more of a global inflationary effect that we need to contend with as well. We don't know what that's going to look like. So I suspect that what ultimately happens is that when you don't know what to do, you pretty much do nothing. That has been what many central banks around the world have done, and I suspect the Reserve Bank is going to be broadly in that picture, and I wouldn't blame them, and I would think that that's the more prudent thing to do, especially if you have a high probability that the inflation target is going to be dropped to 3%. Then why on earth would you want to go and loosen too much and make your future monetary policy decisions that much more difficult than they need to be? The counter argument that but that's not their mandate. Their mandate is 4.5% and between 3 and 6. Well, I mean, that's if you want to be a stickler for absolute specifics on the way that the regulations work. But ultimately, I think some sense will prevail that they will leave rate change next week and that they will tilt a little more conservatively. Mind you, the FRA curve, as I look at it right now, has priced in one rate cut before the end of the year, and then pretty much a 50% chance of something, a year out from now. So things have changed.
Just before we perhaps move on to some international happenings this week, you also did a very big deep dive into what's going on in Argentina. And while we're talking about South Africa the political position, the fiscal position, the monetary position. I mean, there are definitely some lessons that we can take from the sore yielding Milei and what he did to the government structures. I mean, if you just on social media all over, you can see these kind of tick marks that he's been implementing and how successful they have been in literally doing a 180 of the Argentinian economy.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think it's a fascinating case study for any country around the world, especially those with limited resources. And that's why it interested me so much to see what's going on in Argentina and how successful Milei has been, because so much of that can be applied back to South Africa. And I'm not trying to draw a direct comparison between South Africa and Argentina. What I am trying to highlight is the fact that there are alternatives to this entrenched ideology that the ANC has, that a government needs to be big for the people, and it needs to be able to pull every lever conceivable in order to engineer an outcome. And I think what the Argentina example is showing us is that, in fact, the opposite is true. If you have limited resources and a government that is underperforming and ill-equipped to be able to deal with modern day trends and societal changes, sometimes it's better for the government to shrink, to give back power to the private sector, to rather focus on accountability and law enforcement of the private sector, as opposed to trying to get involved to force an outcome. It hasn't worked well in South Africa's case. You can see it in all the numbers across the board. By comparison, I'm having a look at Argentina, and all of a sudden they're running a budget surplus. The interest rates are coming down rapidly. Inflation is coming down rapidly. Even their currency is starting to stabilize at these weaker levels. The machinery of the economy is starting to turn again. They're talking about targeting growth rates just shy of 6% through the course of the next year. I mean, this is astonishing for a country that's struggling so much to now be talking about these sorts of developments. I think is a shining star of what could be done if we just think a little bit differently and learn to trust in the private sector and not always default to this heavy socialism, borderline communist, Marxist kind of approach to managing an economy. I think there's a lot of benefit that could be unleashed for South Africa too.
Yes, we know when Milei came in, there was a lot being said. He was criticized for a lot of what he said, especially against central banks, for example, and some of the state departments. But it's crucial if we want to implement any of the examples that he perhaps implemented in Argentina, is simply, I think, the best example that he is of political will and what can be done. But unless we have that, none of it's going to matter. None of these plans are going to work. None of these failures are going to turn around. So I think the political will and the necessary support for such a character is the first step and key. And I'm not seeing that yet happening in South Africa yet, because who knows with this GNU what can happen. But just back to some of the market news for the week also, obviously we know the ECB is coming up with their rate decisions. No surprises there. I think they're going to stick around, 6.5% with their interest rates. But globally, uncertainties continue to pile up. We saw the Syria-Israel conflict increasing as well. Ukraine's still going on. The tariff situation still playing out. Still a lot of uncertainty, George. But yet the Rand seems to be keeping its cool in all of this, when these things tend to, have a very big impact on EM markets.
Yeah, I think there's just a point to make there is... there are many factors that influence a currency, some of them good, some of them bad. And counterintuitively, sometimes the bad stuff can influence a currency positively. And what I mean by that, by way of example, is South Africa's got less foreign participation now than it used to several years back. And that's because we've dropped into junk territory. It's because we've been on the grey list. If you have a look at the percentages of foreign holdings of South African bonds, they are significantly lower than what they were. You're talking about a drop from 42% down to somewhere around 24, 25%. That's a significant drop. So the amount of hot money volatility that's in the currency market just isn't there to the same extent that it was. And so the speculative element has declined fairly significantly. Then you have a look at some of the underlying fundamentals. So that's on the bad side. On the good side, we've got terms of trade that are looking really, really good. We've got reduced volatility in the currency, which again is good news. We've also got interest rates that are very buoyant, and on ETM's own carry attractiveness index, we are sitting top of the pops. Out of 22 countries, we're sitting at number 1. And so, you know, that's the comparison. And I think there's some powerful pointers that can be taken out of that give us a sense of why the rand has been as resilient as it's been.
That makes sense. Okay, George, thank you very much. It seems like it's going to be a quiet week, but who knows? We'll keep an eye on what's happening in the GNU and elsewhere, and then we will chat again soon.